in the other recordings relating to arrays, and we're not dealing with array lists at this point, just arrays, I showed you two different ways, one method using one line of code, one method using two lines of code to actually declare and allocate memory for an array. And I showed you a third way where you can declare, allocate the memory, and initialize the values if you put the values in the braces. So there's three different ways that you can declare, allocate memory, and or initialize values for an array. And right now we're only dealing with one-dimensional arrays. So we think of it like a row where we have elements or cells where we can put values. Now, when you're in main, if you want to declare an array, one-dimensional array, it's a little bit easier. For example, you want to hold 10 strings to do the one-line declaration. It makes a little more sense here. But when you are in a class file and you want the array, like in the assignment, to indicate or to create a board game, like the board, like a checkerboard, when you're in here and you want the array to be an instance variable, but you don't know the actual size of the array, now this is a 2D array, you don't know the actual size because we're going to let the user tell us the number of rows and columns. Notice how this is the perfect place to use the two-line setup for an array. I have to basically declare it, get Java ready to understand that it's going to need to be ready for a two-dimensional array of type string named board, and then notice how here in the constructor I finish allocating the memory for it by letting Java know the dimensions, the rows and the columns in this case. So when you need to have an array as an instance variable in a class file and you don't know the size until you get into the constructor, this is the perfect place for the two-line setup for an array. The other thing I wanted to point out is that with a one-dimensional array, it's very important that you understand the length, because you're going to be asked on the AP exam, you're going to be given questions saying a string array named XYZ has been correctly declared, memory has been allocated for it, has been initialized by the user. Now write a loop to print out all the values in the array XYZ. It's a string array. Write a loop. Well, if you don't know how many elements are in it, you've got to understand how to use that length, and you've got to understand how to use an array to walk a one-dimensional, how to use a loop to walk a one-dimensional array. So we're going to say that we have an array named XYZ, and we don't know how many elements it has in it because the problem is not going to tell us that. But we want to use a for loop to loop from and they might tell you from beginning to end, the first to the last element, print them all out. The best way to do that, although you could probably use a while loop, the best way to really do that with an array is a for loop. For loops are commonly used with arrays, and most of the time you'll see people use I for index, because remember, even though an array is a collection of things, we still have to have a way to uniquely identify each element so we can grab individual values out of the array. And also remember, we start counting with 0 when we're dealing with arrays. So you can use I here for short for index, or any letter you want. Now the important thing is that you've got to tell it to loop through the entire array, and the way you do that is to use less than the array name dot length. That will always get you from the beginning to the end of the array without giving you any index out of bounds errors with the array. And then we would increment that counter by 1, and then we would say something like that, XYZ, and I being the index, and Java will substitute a 0 in there the first time the loop executes, and it will print out the first item. Then it will substitute a 1 for the second item, a 2 for this I for the third item, and so on, and it will go all the way through. Now if you accidentally put less than equal to, what you're saying is, if for example the array had 5 elements in it, the index numbers go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 5 elements. If you do less than equal to the length is 5. Make no mistake, the length is the count. It's the total number of elements in the array. It's 5. But they are numbered, or their addresses are 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you say less than equal to the length, that equal to is a problem, because what it's saying is loop, go from 0 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and then try to find the element, the 6th element, that has an index number of 5. Well, the addresses only go 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you force it to try to substitute a 5 in there, because the count, the total number, the length is 5, you're going to get index, I think it's going to say array out of bounds, index array out of bounds, meaning that you're trying to access the 6th thing in the array, and there aren't 6, there are only 5. Okay, so don't, on the exam, if you're writing code, just drill it into your mind. You start at 0, and you're going to go less than the length, and that will go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and stop, and you won't get any errors that way. Now what if they told you, and sometimes they'll ask you to print in reverse, go from the end of the array, the last element, and go back from the end all the way down to 1 and print them all out. Well, now we have to really think about this, right? Because we know that if this is, for example, a 5, say that we know that it has 5 elements, okay, 5 strings in there. Again, we can't say start at 5, because when we start counting with 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's 6 numbers. There is no index number 5. The index numbers go from 0 to length minus 1. So if the length is 5, it goes from 4. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 5 elements. So here we would have to say start at length minus 1. That would start us at index number 4. That's the last element in the array. Then we would count down each time, and we would loop as long as I is greater than or equal to 0, because 0 is our first element. So that will take us from 4 to 3 to 2 to 1 to 0, and that will print everything out in reverse. Or what some people like to do, they like to have a variable to use here instead of putting that whole length minus 1. You can do it either way. Either way is fine. Now what if they ask you to print only, the first, the third, the fifth, to skip every other one, right? Just like when you were doing your count up, count down, count by twos type exercises. You would start at 0. You would bump the counter up. You would go from 0 to 2 to 4. And you would still go I less than length. So that's if they wanted you to print the 0, which is the first one, the third one, and so on. So you would go 0, and see, that's the tricky thing. The 0 element is in the first spot, right? Index number 0. 1 is the index for the second spot. 2 is the index for the third spot. So they want you to start at the first one and skip every other one. You're going to go to 0 to 2 to 4. Okay, so you have to kind of think about that. But in any event, I just want you to understand how critically important it is that you understand how to use this length. You can use it in a for loop. You can loop to I, or whatever your counter is, less than length. You can put it in a variable and use that variable, and so on, but you've got to get comfortable with that. And you really have to get the idea that we start counting with 0, and that the last index number for the last element is always the length minus 1. That will always give you, if you don't know how many elements are in the array, and they say what's the index number of the last element, how would you figure that out if you don't know how many things are in the array? How would you print that out? The last index number is always length minus 1. So if my length or my count is 5, I'm using count and length interchangeably. Length is nothing more than how many things are in the array, how many total things, what's the count. So if I have 5 elements, the last index number is 4. It's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, so 5 minus 1. If I have 1,000,000 elements, the last index number is going to be 1,000,000 minus 1. If I have 100,000 elements, the last index number is going to be 100,000 minus 1. What is that, like 99,999? Okay, so you have to get pretty comfortable with the idea that you know what the length is. I'm trying to think what else I need to tell you here. I just have a few minutes left. So one-dimensional array, length is very important. Again, we're not talking about 2D array. We're not dealing with the length of a 2D. That's going to be something we're going to talk about later. This is for one-dimensional arrays, and this is not for array list. This is just for one-dimensional arrays. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of the importance of that length, knowing that length. It should also give you a little bit of insight into how to use a loop to go from the beginning to end, or from the end to the beginning of an array. It should let you see how to use the length in the array, whether I'm going from beginning to end or end to beginning. And again, this is one-dimensional arrays only that we're talking about so far.